Hi everyone. This week we actually are covering a number of theories, but they all connect together. First we'll be talking about labeling theory and reintegrative shaming. Also I've got recordings that I'm adding to these that are on the development and life course theories. And I also have a little bit to talk about on Agnew when he talks about his life course theories. So we're going to start talking about labeling theory and Braithwaite's reintegrative shaming theory. And we're going to see throughout this that these tie in together very well. So we're going to track the intellectual roots. We're going to look at Tannenbaum's dramatization of evil, Lamarck's primary and secondary deviance, and Becker's social reaction and moral entrepreneurs. And then the policy will turn to the reintegrative shaming and restorative justice. So what is labeling theory? It's often called social reaction theory, and this focuses not on the initial causes of crime, but on society's reaction to it. It argues that formal responses such as arrest, adjudication, and incarceration, and informal reactions such as stigma, exclusion, stereotyping, can actually amplify criminal behavior by attaching a deviant identity to the individuals. So at its core, the theory holds that deviance is socially constructed. It's an act that becomes deviant only when others define and react to it as such. So the process of labeling also creates secondary deviance. And this is where individuals internalize the deviant label, altering their self-concept and behavior. This is from the label that they receive from others. So secondary deviance is an individual is seeing themselves as others see them. And over time, the person that's labeled, they may even be pushed farther into what's called the deviant subcultures. And these are conventional opportunities that close off to that individual. And so the classic contributors we're going to look at are Tannenbaum, Lamarck, and Becker. So Tannenbaum argued early formal reactions say tag the person, re-edifying a more deviant identity under this dramatization of evil. In Lamarck, he distinguished primary deviance versus the secondary deviance. And primary deviance, as I said, is episodic rule breaking. And secondary deviance, it follows a stigmatizing reaction from what people have labeled an individual. Now, Becker talked more about how rule making by the powerful moral entrepreneurs and the more enforcement can create outsiders. This is where we've heard of Becker's outsiders. And this is where we're shifting the focus from the act to the social reaction and identity processes. I hope that's clear. The act that occurs results in a social reaction and therefore impacts the identity that someone feels. Now, the central proposition by Akers, Sellers, and Jennings is that criminal or deviant behavior is not inherent in any act. It results from an application of labels by those in authority. And once labeled, individuals may be treated differently and begin to see themselves as deviant. The core mechanisms of labeling are the formal processes. As I talked about, arrest, adjudication, public records, they operate as degradation ceremonies. So once a person is labeled, they will face barriers to school, jobs, housing, structural exclusion that will really amplify the risk. They'll internalize and their networks will really shift that transform occasional behavior into more of a sustained deviant identity. So it goes from occasional to more frequent. So let's talk now about some empirical indicators and some evidence. When we see a consistent pattern, which is really within formal processing, it's controlling for prior behavior. And this pattern predicts additional offending. And it's partly because of collateral consequences. Adolescents are more label sensitive. So settings with intensive surveillance and exclusionary discipline really are going to show stronger labeling dynamics. Sorry about the pauses in between. I'm on a different computer, and so it's not going as fast as I was hoping. But labeling explains the amplification after a first contact really better than initial causes. Enforcement isn't random. Selection complicates inference, and sanctions vary depending on the type of behavior that we're talking about. And shaming can deter when accompanied by respect and pathways. And the effects will also, with labeling, will differ by age, the ties, and the offense type. John Braithwaite's Crime, Shame, and Reintegration from 1989 is one of the most influential extensions of labeling theory, and it's really a cornerstone of restorative justice thinking. He argues that the way society expresses disapproval of a behavior or shame of that behavior determines whether that response will increase or decrease future offending. So shaming can either stigmatize or reintegrate a person. And the difference between these two defines whether crime is amplified or reduced. There are two types of shaming. The first one is the stigmatizing shaming, and this really focuses on the offender's character. In other words, you're a bad person, rather than what you did is bad. And if you've been around really any type of guidance with children, or even talking with children, as a parenting skill, one of the best things to ever say is, you're not the bad person. What you did was bad. The behavior was bad. And this will lead away from this stigmatization. When you stigmatize, it leads to social exclusion, humiliation, and rejection. It will destroy the bonds between the offender and the community, and this in itself increases recidivism. Now, common in societies with weak community ties, but high individualism, for example, punitive justice systems, emphasizing offender accountability without reintegration. Now, the other type is reintegrative shaming, and this really condemns the criminal act, but respects and re-accepts the person after the behavior. Shame is expressed with reintegrative through respectful disapproval, apology, and forgiveness rituals. The process ends with reconciliation and restoration of relationships, and that could include the community. It works best in certain societies that have a strong interdependency, such as families, neighbors, or organizations that really can help maintain those emotional bonds even when there is disapproval. The Braithwaite explains the mechanisms of reintegrative shaming, and he explains crime control through several interrelated mechanisms that are here on the slide. Moral disapproval, and this is where the community really expresses together the collective norms, reinforcing boundaries of acceptable behavior. We also have social bonding, and this is where shame is temporary, but it's followed by a reaffirmation of the offender's membership within the group, within society. Interdependency. Now, this is when people care about each other's opinions. Shame carries really a moral force when it's interdependent. And restoration. This is where offenders are encouraged to repair their harm, apologize, provide restitution, and restore social trust, which is the major part of restorative justice. Programs must avoid pressuring victims or really widening the net. For serious harm, reintegration may come later with stringent safeguards. Voluntariness, facilitator equality, and equity checks are essential. And this requires safeguards for victim autonomy and due process. And Braithwaite also talks about the theoretical integration, and he integrates multiple traditions. And labeling theory, the first one, he keeps the insight that stigmatization can actually worsen the crime. So when you look at labeling, we're labeling someone, and that can increase those offending behaviors. Control theory, he borrows the idea that strong social bonds restrain deviance, and we talked about this last week. He also looks at subcultural theory, and he notes that exclusion drives offenders towards deviant peer groups. And the result is a hybrid social control theory. And this is where informal community regulation is more effective than formal punitive control. So the community can impact the individual much better than the punitive society, the punitive system. And with reintegrative shaming, we can look at different cases, like for instance, a youth shoplifting. So there's two pathways when a youth is approached with, the first responder or the regulator. So we have a formal petition versus diversion that includes the restorative justice conference. And so we can walk through decisions. For instance, a quick plea might clear the docket, but it'll carry labels that can derail schooling. Now, diversion that includes apology and restitution, it can take coordination, but it better preserves the conventional trajectories. Reintegrative shaming has influenced many restorative justice and community-based practices, such as the restorative justice conferences and victim offender mediation, family group conferencing, problem solving and specialty courts, community policing that emphasizes respect and reintegration, and diversion programs that I talked about that really avoid the stigmatizing labels like offender or criminal or delinquent. Just want to end this part of the presentation with showing you a few key terms. The dramatization of evil that we talked about, primary, secondary deviance. These are important terms to learn. Moral entrepreneurs, status degradation, stigmatization versus the reintegrative shaming, the positiveness of reintegrative shaming. Also communitarianism, procedural justice, and restorative conferencing. So next, I'm going to talk about social disorganization theory as well as the urban ecology of crime and delinquency, followed by the development in life course theories.